Let us begin. We look up at the night sky, and we see a red dot, and we think, there, that is the place we will go next. It is a beautiful thought, it is a human thought. And it is almost completely disconnected from the physics of what it would actually mean to arrive there. Most people imagine that if a Mars mission ends in death, it will be because something goes wrong in the middle of the flight. An explosion. A leak. A navigation error that sends the ship hurtling past the planet into the void. But the truth is more specific, and it is more brutal. The most likely moment of death is not in the transit. It is not on the surface. It is the moment of descent itself. Mars will kill you before you even touch the ground, and it will kill you with a paradox so elegant that it deserves a moment of silence before we begin. My name is Albert Einstein, and I'm going to walk you through the physics of that paradox. Because when you understand it, you will never look at a Mars landing the same way again. But before I go any deeper, I want to pause. Because I know the kind of person who is watching this video. You are someone who has watched the simplified explanations. You have seen the animations of the parachute opening and the retro rockets firing. And you have felt, somewhere in the back of your mind, that there is a deeper layer. A layer where the numbers themselves become the story. That is exactly why I put together the Reality Decoder bundle. Inside it, I walk through the truth about gravity. It is not a force, I will show you. The hidden architecture of light, why time does not flow the way you feel it, the quantum reality happening inside your own cells, why your brain lies to you about reality, the science behind humming and grounding and reading aloud, the brutal physics of deep space travel, the silence of the universe, and finally how consciousness emerges from all of it. All in plain language. No equations. The link is in the pinned comment right below. Now, let us return to the descent. Let me describe the problem to you from the perspective of the physics. You are in a spacecraft approaching Mars. You have survived the 6 to 9 months of transit. You have endured the radiation, the bone loss, the psychological weight of knowing that Earth is a distant dot. You are now falling toward the planet. The capsule weighs roughly 1 ton, perhaps more depending on the mission architecture. And you are moving at a speed of approximately 21,000 kilometers per hour relative to the surface. That is hypersonic. That is Mach 17. Now, on Earth, when a capsule re-enters the atmosphere at similar speeds, the atmosphere is thick enough to slow the vehicle dramatically through aerodynamic drag. The air itself becomes a brake. But on Mars, the atmosphere is only 1% of Earth's density at the surface. 1%. That is not a typo. The atmosphere is so thin that if you tried to use the same entry profile as an Earth re-entry, you would hit the ground at a speed that would turn the capsule into a crater. And yet, it is not thin enough to be ignored, because at Mach 17, even a thin atmosphere is a wall of fire. The friction from the thin air generates temperatures on the heat shield of over 2,000 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to melt steel. That is hot enough to vaporize the capsule if the heat shield fails for even a fraction of a second. So you have a double bind. The atmosphere is too thin to slow you down enough, but it is thick enough to burn you alive if you hit it too fast. This is the paradox I mentioned. Now let me take you through the numbers so you can feel the tension. The terminal velocity of a falling object on Mars is determined by the same equation as on Earth, but the result is dramatically different. On Earth, a human falling through the atmosphere reaches a terminal velocity of roughly 200 kilometers per hour. On Mars, because the air is so thin, a human falling through the same atmosphere would reach a terminal velocity of roughly 1,200 kilometers per hour. That is the speed of a bullet. And that is for a human. A capsule, with its larger surface area, would have a slightly lower terminal velocity, but still in the range of 800 to 1,000 kilometers per hour. You cannot survive that impact, so you must slow down. But how? This is where the engineering becomes a kind of desperate art. You have 3 tools, and you must use all 3 in sequence, and each one is a gamble. The first tool is aerobraking. You use the capsule's shape and its heat shield to create drag. You angle the vehicle so that it skims the upper atmosphere, bleeding off speed through friction. But the atmosphere is so thin that this process is slow. You cannot just dip in and slow down. You have to ride the edge of the atmosphere for minutes, bleeding speed meter by meter, all while the heat shield glows white hot. The Curiosity rover, which landed in 2012, experienced what NASA called the 7 minutes of terror. 7 minutes from the top of the atmosphere to the surface. 7 minutes during which the entire sequence had to execute perfectly, with no human intervention, because the communication delay from Earth was 14 minutes one way. By the time Mission Control knew the landing had begun, it was already over. That is the level of uncertainty we are talking about. The second tool is the parachute. But here is the ugly truth about parachutes on Mars. A parachute works by creating drag. Drag depends on the density of the air. On Earth, a parachute can slow a capsule from subsonic speeds to a gentle landing. On Mars, a parachute only becomes effective at speeds below Mach 1.5, roughly 1/800 kilometers per hour, and even then, it can only slow the vehicle to about 300 kilometers per hour before the air becomes too thin to provide any meaningful drag. So you have to deploy the parachute at supersonic speeds. That is not a typo. The parachute opens while the capsule is still moving faster than the speed of sound. The physics of a supersonic parachute are not fully understood. The shock waves that form around the parachute can cause it to collapse, to tear, to oscillate violently. Every Mars mission that has used a parachute has had to model this with computational fluid dynamics that push the limits of our understanding. And even then, it is a gamble. The parachute for the Perseverance rover, which landed in 2021, was 21.5 meters in diameter. It was the largest supersonic parachute ever built. And it still could not do the job alone. Which brings us to the third tool, the retro rockets. After the parachute has done its work, the capsule is still falling at hundreds of kilometers per hour. At an altitude of roughly 2 kilometers above the surface, the parachute is cut loose. The capsule is now in free fall. The retro rockets fire. They must slow the capsule from roughly 300 kilometers per hour to 0 in the final seconds before impact. That is a deceleration of multiple Gs. The rockets must fire with precise timing. If they fire too early, they waste fuel and you crash. If they fire too late, you hit the ground. The fuel must be exactly calculated for the mass of the vehicle, the altitude, the atmospheric conditions. And the atmospheric conditions on Mars are not constant. Dust storms can change the density of the air by 10% or more. That changes the drag. That changes the parachute performance. That changes the rocket burn. The margin for error is measured in centimeters per second. That is not an exaggeration. The landing system for the Perseverance rover had a velocity tolerance at touchdown of less than 1 meter per second. 1 meter per second is roughly the speed of a slow walk. If you hit the ground at 3 meters per second, the rover's suspension could break. If you hit at 5 meters per second, the rover could tip over. If you hit at 10 meters per second, the rover is destroyed. And all of this is happening with a communication delay of 11 to 14 minutes. The vehicle must land itself. It must see the ground, compute its trajectory, and fire the rockets, all without human input. And it has to do it on a planet where the gravity is 38% of Earth's, which means the dynamics of the fall are different from anything we have tested on Earth. We cannot simulate Mars gravity in a terrestrial test. We can approximate it with reduced gravity aircraft, but only for 20 seconds at a time. The full landing sequence takes minutes. Now I want to show you what this means in concrete terms. Let me walk through the Curiosity landing sequence. The capsule enters the atmosphere at 21,000 kilometers per hour. The heat shield reaches 100 degrees Celsius. The capsule is decelerating at 10 gigaseconds. That is the aerobraking phase. After about 4 minutes, the speed has dropped to 1/800 kilometers per hour. The parachute deploys. The shockwave from the supersonic parachute creates a series of oscillations that the engineers had modeled, but they were not certain would hold. The parachute holds. The capsule continues to slow. After another 2 minutes, the speed is down to 300 kilometers per hour. The heat shield is jettisoned. The radar begins to map the surface. The rover is now hanging below the parachute capsule on 3 tethers. This is the sky crane maneuver. The retro rockets on the descent stage fire. The rover is lowered on the tethers at a rate of 1 meter per second. The rockets have to adjust for the changing mass as the rover descends. They have to compensate for the wind, which on Mars can reach speeds of 100 kilometers per hour. The rover touches down. The tethers are cut. The descent stage, now lighter, flies away and crashes at a safe distance. The whole sequence, from the top of the atmosphere to the surface, takes 7 minutes, and every single second of those 7 minutes contains a failure mode. And the failure modes are not independent. If the parachute tears, the retro rockets have to compensate, but they only have enough fuel for the final phase. If the heat shield fails, the capsule is destroyed before the parachute even opens. If the radar misreads the terrain, the sky crane could lower the rover onto a boulder. Every Mars lander has faced this gauntlet. The InSight lander, which landed in 2018, used a similar sequence. But InSight was heavier than Curiosity. The parachute had to be redesigned. The rocket burn had to be recalculated. And it worked, but the margin was still terrifyingly thin. The entry, descent, and landing team for InSight described the moment of parachute deployment as the longest 4 seconds of their careers. Because if the parachute had failed, the lander would have hit the ground at 400 kilometers per hour. There was no backup. Now I want to connect this back to the larger point. The descent is not just a technical challenge. It is a physical manifestation of the fundamental relationship between humans and the universe. We want to go to Mars. That is a beautiful desire. But Mars is not waiting for us with open arms. Mars is waiting with a thin atmosphere that cannot slow us down, a gravity that is too weak to help us land, and a surface that is covered in dust and rocks and craters. The descent is the moment when all the romanticism of space travel collides with the cold, hard reality of physics. And the physics does not care about our dreams. The physics does not care about the funding. The physics does not care about the political will. The physics cares only about the numbers. And the numbers say that landing on Mars is one of the hardest things humans have ever attempted. If this is hitting home for you, if you are the kind of person who wants to understand the physics beneath the surface, I want to remind you that the Reality Decoder Bundle is waiting for you in the pinned comment. It is not a summary of what I have said here. It is a deeper dive into the architecture of reality itself, the truth about gravity, the hidden structure of light, the quantum world inside your own cells, the silence of the universe, and how consciousness emerges from all of it. No equations, just the ideas the way I would explain them to a thoughtful student. The link is in the pinned comment. Go there. So I want to close with a thought. The next time you see a video of a Mars rover landing, and you hear the cheers from Mission Control, I want you to remember what you have learned here. I want you to remember that those cheers are not just for a successful landing. They are for surviving a sequence that defies the odds. They are for threading a needle that is measured in meters per second and degrees Celsius. They are for proving that human ingenuity can, at least for a moment, overcome the physics of a planet that does not want us there. But the physics is still waiting, and it will not stop waiting. Every landing is a victory. But every landing is also a reminder that the margin is thin, and if we ever send humans, the margin will be even thinner. Because a human cannot be replaced by a software patch. A human cannot be folded into a smaller package. A human must survive the descent with all the fragility of a body that evolved on a different planet. And that is the final truth. Mars will kill you before you even touch the ground, unless you understand the physics well enough to cheat. And even then, it is a gamble. The link to the Reality Decoder Bundle is in the pinned comment. It will give you the full picture, not the simplified version. The truth. Go find it, and then come back and watch the next landing with new eyes.